The most valuable skill you can learn right now is storytelling, especially personal storytelling. With AI taking over the internet, content is getting more superficial, more artificial, and people are dying for more connection and more emotion. If you can tell stories, you will have a massive advantage in such an uncertain future. Now, my first viral post 5 years ago was a personal story, and since then, I've committed to telling a story almost every single day with my brand. It is directly responsible for over 280,000 readers, and every sales email I've sent is story driven, and that's responsible for now over $1.5 million worth of sales. In this video, I share everything that I have learned over an hour storytelling masterclass, and I've literally read every book and put everything into practice. So this is not just theory, and we're going to go through why storytelling is so powerful, the only two types of stories you need to tell for your business, one framework so you can tell any story simply, and then 5 storytelling rules that guarantee your stories will stand out from the crowd. And I will tell a story in real time so you can see the advice in action. I hope you enjoy.
Awesome. Right. So, storytelling masterclass. To start this presentation, I would like to start with a story, funnily enough. Last night, my girlfriend, Carolina, if you don't know Carolina, she is from Ecuador, and she was really upset because she has got loads of work going on, loads of client stuff, and she's also applying for a visa to come to England to spend the summer with me, meet my family. And that's a big process. And she did all the work for it, and it actually it got declined. Okay, and so she got me really upset, and I wanted to be like, yeah, don't worry about it. Focus on what you can control. Crying does nothing. Don't say that to your girlfriend ever. But instead, I knew that would land on deaf ears, and so I actually I told her a story. I told her the story about my neck, and I explained. I mean, she's heard it before, but like just a very specific part of the story, which we'll speak about in a moment, like beats. I told her about the fact that I used to be very focused on the future with a lot of anxiety. And then when I had my neck diagnosis, which you guys probably know, but I had a brain tumor at 16, that really like skyrocketed my anxiety. And for 2 years, I was constantly worrying about this thing happening. But on the day of the operation, the weirdest thing happened. So I was lying on the surgery bed where we're kind of rolling towards the theater. And I felt this incredible sense of calm, sense of relief, because actually my life was in the surgeon's hands. There was literally nothing I could do about it. I'm going to come out dead or alive. And the only thing I could control was my response. And my mum was walking next to me. Obviously, she was very upset. And so I started telling her jokes. And, we were laughing and smiling. And it taught me a very important lesson. I think one of the fundamental truths of life, and that is we focus on what we can control. And I came out of that operation, and I really have built my life around that. There's a lot of things that go wrong, especially with how clumsy and silly I can be sometimes. But I can only do what we can control. And as I explained this to Carolina, I was like, we can focus on how the visa goes wrong or went wrong and all of this, or we can say like, what's the next step? What is the thing that we can do? And I'm not suggesting like she just suddenly felt amazing and everything was cool, but you could see that the story had the impact. Okay, I managed to get this point across, and this leads me to the important part about storytelling is that people don't want to be told what to do; they want to be shown. And I never used to be a storyteller, like at all. I read stories all the time, but I was very, kind of closed up, and I wouldn't like to talk about myself. But what happened was as you guys would know from some of the content I've shared, but my first viral post was a story. Again, the neck. I just love milking this thing. It really helps if you get a brain tumor. By the way, there's got to be some good in it. And since then, I fell in love with storytelling because, well, for one, it's just a fantastic way to transfer emotion, to transfer ideas, but also if you're interested in, let's say, power or status or whatever, like building a good business, all of it, storytelling is one of the most important skills. So there's a cool quote from Jeff Bezos in 2012. He was at a fireside chat and someone asked him, like, how did you build the flywheel for Amazon? And he said, he was like, everyone always asks me what's going to change in the next 10 years. But no one really asked me what's not going to change. And actually, the things to build a business strategy around are on the things that are timeless. Okay. So you focus on what's going to change. So as I was saying, this is the question that was asked. What we want to do is build skills on things that are stable in time. And this is particularly important right now because everyone's like, oh, what should I learn with AI? What should I learn as the internet's changing? And the thing is, storytelling has been here since the start. Since we could grunt at each other and hit each other with sticks, we've been telling each other stories. And you actually look through history. I mean, Plato has this a piece where he's warning the world that storytellers are basically evil and will take over society. Okay, and then every single cultural movement, political shift, anything around like media, fashion, it's all driven by stories. Storytelling, the cool bit with storytelling that I like is that it is anti-fragile. And what do I mean by anti-fragile? If you're familiar with Nicholas Taleb, what he explains is that there are certain things that thrive in chaos. Okay, and so the more uncertain the world becomes, the more power goes to the storyteller, because people want the familiarity of a story, and also they want someone to tell the story of where the world is going. Okay. The other part about storytelling then is that the internet is full of people telling other people what to do, all right? And so you really stand out when you can show them instead. And because we are actually evolutionarily wired to pay attention to stories, so the people that ignored the stories when they were cavemen just ended up lion food, right? Like, don't go behind that bush, and they're like, you'll be fine, and then dead, right? Obviously, it's not so severe now, but if I start with a story, if you tell a story to your audience, there's a much higher chance they pay attention, and more importantly, there is a much higher chance they take action. Okay, and the reason being that people do not care about facts or figures. They care about how you make them feel. Emotion drives action. Okay. So hopefully I've just sold you on the idea of storytelling, and we're going to talk about a few things of how to do it. We're going to talk about picking the right stories, what makes a good story, a framework, one framework, as always. I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible for you. One story to tell frameworks, and then a couple of storytelling rules that build on the copywriting principles that you've been playing with over the past 3-4 weeks. Let's start about picking the right story. The first and most important rule of business storytelling is remembering that you are not the hero, your reader is. Right? Even if it is about you, it is about them. Okay? Why is this important? Well, if you think about, I always get asked, what do you think of this story? Is this going to be effective? The way you can tell if a story is great, right, is if it will help them the most. Right? And so one of the key ways that I like to think about this is proximity. The closer a story is to the story that you're telling your one true fan anyway, the transformation that they want, right, the higher chance they see themselves in it, and so the higher chance of change. For example, if I wanted to inspire people to write, the story about me going viral on my first post is 100 times, well, not 100 times, but like it's a lot more effective than if I tell the story about my first 6 months of learning Spanish. Okay. And so we want to stay close to the transformation, but on the flip side, we don't just want to be a one-trick pony with our storytelling, right? If I'm sure you guys have seen this, like when you get the brands that are so optimized that they found their 5 stories and they just tell them over and over and over. The problem is people like to feel close to brands, close to the writer. And so you can tell stories from the wider world, right? Your wider experience, if we lean into the technique we discussed earlier, which is the transformation tieback technique. So if you remember this, I'll just give you a very brief run through. I was going to say Alex Hormozy. Yeah, I was like, I actually had to stop listening to him because I was like, I haven't heard a new story in ages. Anyhow, transformation tieback technique. So let's take the Spanish thing. I want people to know that I have been learning Spanish. Okay. Where else? What's the point? No, it's fun. And I can use this to teach my transformation because, for example, I could say the first 6 months of learning Spanish was absolute hell. I thought I knew what I was doing. I put myself out there. I sounded like an idiot the whole time. And I came close to quitting, but just by immersion, things got better and better. And if that doesn't describe perfectly writing online, I don't know what does. And so the cool bit with stories is that there are universal lessons. Okay, you tell the story, and then we're going to go to the format. You tell the story, you share the universal lesson. The universal lesson acts as a bridge to bring it back to the transformation tieback technique. Okay, so you have like, the story to here and then that to there. And so that's the way that we can tell stories that aren't quite within our business, but bring it back to the business. And I like to have both of these, okay? 2 types of stories to tell. So we'll go through more examples in a moment, and as I said, I'll show you some emails at the end. The first one are campfire stories, okay? So these are the big stories that we just kind of mentioned, the ones like you pull them out of the bag when someone asks a question, you've said them a million times, it's very crisp and polished, and they support your key points, the points that we've been discussing, your needle moving ideas, your most polarizing points. We want to start coming up with stories to support them. We also have current stories. So that's what is happening right now. So let's take a look at both of them. First, campfire. When I was I began to appreciate the importance of campfire storytelling when I was in Cape Town in 2024. Someone had connected me with a group of entrepreneurs, a group of nomads, and I went for dinner with them. I didn't know anyone, but I went there, and they sat me next to this 8-figure entrepreneur, and immediately my insufficiencies kicked in, and I was like, oh my god, I'm gonna have nothing to say to this dude. I'm not an interesting guy. And we sat next to each other, and he went, oh, you're Kieran Drew, right? I was like, fuck, yeah. And he was like, that dentist to writer hook is a hell of a story. And I was really surprised because I hadn't actually mentioned that story in months, right? Because I thought my audience were bored of it. I was bored of it. Right? I thought I needed fresh material, but actually, one of the key principles behind storytelling is you're going to get bored of your story long before your reader will. It's the repetition that leads to resonance. Okay, and it's people like familiarity. They like to hear the same story. Okay, I mean, we just said about like the same 5, but it's the same story but taken from different angles, which we'll speak about in a moment. And so, to support your campfire storytelling, okay, what we need to think about is, what is the story that supports your transformation most? Or to reframe it as a question you're familiar with from earlier, is what makes you remarkable? Now, when I say remarkable, I do not mean, like out of this world, right? It means worthy of remark. And that means outside the status quo, outside what makes you normal, okay? Now, for your campfire story, for your kind of big like main story, you wanted to support the transformation. So some examples from clients, okay? We have a corporate executive who built a 7-figure business while keeping his main job, and then he quit, right? And so he gets to help people do that. We have a mental health coach diagnosed with testicular cancer at 18, right? And led to a big health transformation. And, his T levels are like triple what a normal guy's is. And he's only got 1 ball. Right? It's a good story. And he makes a lot of money because of that. an executive coach for founders, and he had a severe bleeding disorder, which led to like this really cool journey of self-awareness. And now he's like a wizard for asking the right questions. Last I spoke to him, a guy had just signed up, and he was a founder of a $1 billion company. So, an injury specialist, right? He overcame this permanent back injury that was told no chance at all. And I actually, he's a client, but I was also a client because I am like a walking nightmare for bodies, and he helped me a lot. And it's because he was so passionate about solving long-term pain. And then, female entrepreneur who went from broke to building a 7-figure business, and she actually closed the whole thing down because it felt out of alignment. And that's what she gets to write about. And you might be sitting here now and thinking, oh, these guys are so lucky because, they have the story that lets them build the business, or they can build a business because they have the story. But that's the thing, right? They get to build the business because they've lived something. And so if you hear this and you're like, oh, I don't have anything impressive like this, great, go do something. All right? Write about it. Tell the story in public. No one cared about it when I was a dentist who didn't like his job. Right? People paid attention when I began to solve the problem. So we want to think about what makes you remarkable, okay? But if I tried to tell the story of going from dentist to writer in one, we would be here for about an hour and a half, and you're going to be like, what the hell, that was way too much. And actually what we're thinking about in a story is composed of beats. Okay, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. And so we can use this to begin to tell our story bit by bit by focusing on snapshot moments. And what a snapshot moment is, a specific moment in time. Actually, I'll give you some prompts to help us do this. These prompts are built from kind of classic storytelling techniques. So we have the first one, which is the moment that inspired your purpose, right? Specific moment. We're going to hear about specificity again in a second, but specific moment that inspired you to pursue your purpose. For example, one of the main ones that inspired me to be a writer was, I think it's like the first week when COVID hit. I'm out on the balcony, the sun's shining, and a friend sent me Naval Ravikant's podcast, How to Get Rich. And I literally remember listening. I was like, I'll pop it on for 20 minutes when I'm doing my stretching. It's a 4-hour podcast, right? And I didn't leave the balcony. I listened to the whole thing and I was like, holy shit, I've got it all wrong. I've been building the wrong career and all of this. And I get to tell that story to show when there was this arc. Okay. I'm going to talk about, hating my life beforehand and then getting some work done after. What belief did you once hold to be completely false? And when did you realize you were wrong? Really good one, because to change other people's minds, show how you changed your own. It also taps into our vulnerability that we spoke about in the last lesson, right? Because if you can actually say, hey, like, whoa, I was wrong about something, it's a lot braver than just telling the world they're wrong. I speak quite a lot about how I got the whole money thing wrong. How I was working in a career that I didn't actually enjoy, but because it was very successful, golden handcuffs, this sort of stuff. And I can't tell you how many people resonate with that. Other beliefs I've got wrong, which are more recent, is that like I kind of thought hustling was the point. But now, as you guys know, I'm kind of on this whole like spiritual hippie stuff. So like a lot of inner work getting done. But I actually think that the inner work, the being able to be authentic and in alignment, is the best way to be successful. You just got to be brave enough to like hit the brakes for a while and think. Okay. Your first and worst attempt at what you do now. People love hearing when things go wrong. And so again, if you guys have been with me for some of the journey, I tell a story about how I built a guide called Get in Dentistry. That was my first attempt at writing. This is in the live presentation we were just talking about on the weekend, where I talk about how I wrote like 178 pages of a book that no one ever bought. I didn't have an audience, didn't have customers. Right? And it was a great way to explain the principle of validate before you create. Your first and or most incredible win. So this is so powerful because storytelling is a transfer of emotion, and there is nothing cooler than reading about someone, you know, having a really good win, particularly after like they've tried hard, you know, they've struggled, maybe some stuff has gone wrong. Um, and it's funny because, like, for example, my favorite win of all still, and I don't know if that's a little bit sad or not, is my first product sale. You know, obviously I've made a fair amount of money now. But nothing was as cool as that moment when I saw Gumroad email land in the inbox. I was sprinting up and down my flat, fist pumping, shouting at the top of my lungs, which is never really that loud. And then I remember going outside and it was pissing it down. And it's like 9 a.m. on a miserable like Monday morning. And I'm just walking around in my t-shirt with this stupid grin on my face for like 2 hours. And it's a really nice story to tell because, you know, it took me 18 months to get to that point. The mentor who changed your life or changed your path. I kind of mentioned one to you here about how, and it doesn't have to be like a physical interaction. So I mentioned about Naval Ravikant being a big one for me. I know kind of Naval, especially if you're on Twitter, has become like too memeable where it's like, oh, great, you're a Naval fan and you go viral that way. But the amount of people that I have created a relationship with because we have a shared interest in his ideas, I get to talk about that. Another mentorship story was I was doing a diploma in cosmetic dentistry before I was writing, or as I was starting writing, I was writing in secret. But the guy who gave this diploma, he's one of the best dentists in the UK. He's also a writer. And one day, about 6 months in, I told him, I was like, hey man, like I've actually been writing as well. Like I'm kind of in this whole philosophy thing. And he was like, that's really cool. Send me something. And so I did. And I saw him a month later and he pulled me to the side and was like, I know you've just spent like $15,000 with me, but I think you should quit dentistry. And he was like, this is really good. And like, he's like, if you keep going down this route, I think you're probably going to find a stronger passion. That guy changed my life. It's a lovely story. The scariest moment in your journey. Okay. And how did you overcome it? I mean, for me, that's just quitting. That was quitting dentistry, like about a million miles. And then the fears now that are probably a bit more relatable is like the fear of building the wrong business. You know, the tension between being a marketer, being an artist. Like these sort of stories, people, I was telling them a lot over the weekend, and people really click with that. Coming close to giving up. This is super relatable because so many of us want to give up. You know, so many of us come to the brink, as we like to say, and like, what pulled you away? And yeah, one thing that pulled me away, I suffer from this thing called writing wobbles, I like to call them, which is basically where I'm like, what the hell am I doing? Why am I so dumb? Why is everyone so much better at writing? You know, and it still happens, by the way, which is crazy because you're always looking ahead, right? You're never looking behind. One of the things that stopped me from giving up is by having my 3 internal metrics, right? My internal scorecard. And that is, did I get better at my craft today? Did I learn something new today? And did I share an idea to help someone else win? And I can tell that story to say that, look, if you keep improving, keep learning, and keep serving, you will get what you want on a long enough time frame. So these are cool prompts. It's all written down for you, by the way, so you can have a work through. And the thing is, again, I really don't want to overwhelm you. So when I say all that and you're like, wow, Kieran, you have this like package of stories that are just kind of flowing off the tongue. I didn't have any of that when we started, right? Storytelling is a skill. And when you read these prompts, some days you'll be like, oh, wow, I have 5 things I might say to this. And some days you're like, wow, have I ever lived before? I have nothing to give. That's cool because you take reps, right? When you're doing it now, you're creating in public, you're seeing what you enjoyed, you double down on stuff that you had a nice signal feeling inside, or potentially someone telling you that was really cool. One of them, by the way, just as a side note, one of my favorite ways to test stories is in person. It's quite hard. I mean, you can get people to reply to emails and social content and be like, wow, that's amazing. But there's something about seeing someone else's face. There's something about like the level of engagement you can see someone having when you're actually just telling a story. And you can also feel how boring you are sometimes. You know, when you realize that, like, I don't know, like, for example, there's always that old relative that tells you a story that's like 20 minutes long and then it ends and you were like, have we finished? Like, what did you just tell me? You get to practice that quite quickly when you're speaking. And so we get to repeat these stories. Campfire ones, okay? We then have the other side, current. So with current storytelling, this is what is happening right now, okay? The cool bits with this is that you have your big ideas, right? Your pillar ideas, most polarizing points, needle moving ideas, the stuff that we've just been doing. And the thing is, if you're just saying the same stories, which is what we touched on before, it's like, it gets a bit boring. But when you have new stories, new material, you create this really cool magnetic effect of being fresh yet familiar. It's like, oh, hey, look, it's Kieran telling me to write every day again. But, you know, this time he got lost in a mountain and came up with an idea. And it's quite cool, right? And it gets to do that. Remember we spoke about in this week's thing about amplifying what makes you awesome. Okay, finding a few things that make you different. Well, this is where current storytelling comes in. You know, it's your habits, hobbies, things that make you weird. You get to tell these stories and tie it back. And unfortunately, this is where a lot of social media gurus fall apart. Because if you look up storytelling content, everyone is telling you the frameworks. Master the hero's journey, you know, become the 3-part structures, all of this, but it's not about frameworks, okay? It's about living an interesting life. All right? Now, I've spoken a little bit about taking notes before with this kind of live, look, learn exercise, where if you're going about your day and you're looking for interesting conversations, observations, actions, emotions, ideas, anything that's kind of popping in, if you make a habit of taking notes, right, for interest, that shows curiosity, underneath those interests are stories. And you can train your mind to see them by just writing what happened and writing a quick lesson, right? And so if you're not doing it already, take 5 minutes at the end of each day and say, what was 3 interesting things that's happened and what potential lessons could there be? Okay, and I could try to do some off the cuff from yesterday, but I didn't really do much except get lost in a forest. I mean, that said, it was a 5-hour walk in a forest, and I actually guys, I downloaded some podcasts on the drive there. And after about half an hour in, I was like, oh, I'm so sick of my own thoughts. I'm going to listen to a podcast. And actually, they didn't download, and there's no signal in the mountains. And so, you know, I was like, oh, wow, I've got 5 hours of my thoughts. And I came out of that walk with like 30 ideas, and I had cleared up some problems. And so I could tell the story about why, like, silence and space is so important. And, you know, forget the headphones. It's a nice story. Okay, so current storytelling. Do shit, do interesting shit, talk about it, and then tie it back to a transformation. Components of a good story then. Let's start looking at the mechanisms. There's a really cool quote. I love concise explanations, and this one is from Frank Daniel, who is the head of, I think it's like film at Columbia University. Somebody wants something and has difficulty getting it. That's a story. There's another guy, Aaron Sorkins, who says, I worship at the altar of intention and obstacle. Someone wants something, they have difficulty getting it. We can break this down into 4 components then. Right? We have character, the person. Stories have characters so that we can, if they're the hero, you know, see ourselves in them in some way. And that doesn't mean by being heroic. Usually it's the flaws, it's the fears, it's the bad decisions that people make. And you're like, oh, I probably would have made that too. Okay, those are the things that actually people can relate to, but it can also be the humor and the quirks and these sort of things. And we also have characters, like evil characters too, but you're not going to be telling, you know, Lord of the Rings here. So I wouldn't worry so much going down that route. We have conflict. Conflict is so important, right? A story without conflict is just, it's not worth telling. And so what I mean by conflict is that something has to get in the way. Okay, then we have stakes. So what are stakes? Stakes is that something has to matter. All right. Like, so if I was to tell you, actually, we're going to do one, but if I was to tell you a story about how I went for a walk in my garden and then I stopped walking in my garden, you'd be like, what the hell, man? I don't care. But if I was to say, like, I'm going to go for a walk in my garden because I have to decide, I don't know, like where I'm going to live for the rest of my life, there's some stakes there, right? You're kind of like, oh, okay, well, what happened on this walk? And then we have a lesson. So first and foremost, or primarily, a story is a vehicle for lessons, right? Even if they're not explicitly said, although when we're doing business storytelling, we can do. Every film, every book has universal lessons they're trying to teach you. Okay. So again, we said Lord of the Rings, but Lord of the Rings is about that you could be more than you expect. The Hobbit takes on the whole world, saves the world. Right? What an amazing story. And if you like, I could keep going on and on about all of these, but like, there's always a lesson. Okay. And so that's what I mean. If we look for the lesson, we can become someone that's good at noticing interesting things and tying it to lessons. It's a great skill. I used to with my old girlfriends. Maybe it's why she's my old girlfriend. But we would always do this thing where she would like try to get me to find lessons in like loads of random little things, and it was really fun. I sucked at first, and now I'd say I'm pretty good. So anyway, it's not about me; it's about you. Let's do a story. I'll show you how this can be quite a boring story. Let's say I'm gonna make a cup of coffee for my gran, a hot drink for my gran. All right, well, there's no conflict. Well, let's say I'm gonna make coffee or tea, then there's a bit of conflict. What am I gonna make? But you don't really care, there's no stakes. But what if I was to tell you that it might be the last drink my gran was ever gonna drink because she's going in for life-threatening surgery tomorrow? And then you're like, fuck. That's the story. Okay, and we're gonna tell this story together now. But first, I just want to make sure, or want to show you the framework that I use for storytelling. So I mentioned that, people have the 7-part and 3-part acts. And I mean, there's one that's like 18 points and all of this. And I'm guilty, by the way. If you look at my storytelling content from like 4 years ago, it does all that too. People trying to sound smart, right? Like, the truth is, for your business, you need to tell a simple story well. Right? You need someone to be like, I understand what just happened. I feel something. That was cool. And we do this with the HEAL framework. Okay. Here's what happened. Here's how I felt. Here's what I did. And here's what I learned. We can use this, by the way, to tell stories about other people too. So, here's what my client did. Here's how he felt or she. Here's what she did. And here's what she learned. And we can use it to also tell big stories. So some of you guys would have read my story about my phone getting robbed in Buenos Aires, which was like a 3-day roller coaster of me just getting screwed over again and again and again. And all I'm doing actually is saying, here's what happened, here's how I felt, and here's what I did. And here's what happened next, here's how I felt, and here's what I did. And it just kept going and going and going. And then eventually I get to the lesson. Okay. So this simple 4-stage format. Like if you read emails, you'll see it all the time. There's a hook. Here's what happened. This really fits our magnetic. It's the same magnetic post format. Okay, so connection is what happened. Some of you guys have been telling stories already, which I love. And one thing that me and Dave have been telling you is like, great, delete that bit at the start where you're like, one of the most important things is just dive into the story. Okay, and then emotion and action is the explanation, which we've done in the magnetic post format. You're just telling people, but instead of actually telling them, now you're showing them. And the lesson is obviously the solution. The most important part of a story is the same as the most important part with writing. It's the start. The mistake people make is clearing their throat. They start by like, it was a Tuesday afternoon and I was a bit tired and, I was kind of doing this thing and you go on and on like this, but people don't give a shit, right? Nobody owes you their attention. You must grab them by the throat. And we do this by beginning in the action such that we create a question. This is not new for you guys now. We've done this in the writing thing, but it's the same thing. So for example, if we take that Tuesday afternoon one versus this line, a sob escapes my throat. Why is he sobbing? What happened? First thing first, and then the person is in. Okay, the subconscious commitment is there. You've created what we discussed before called a curiosity gap. Right, and so that's what we're doing when we create a question by implying change. Now, again, please appreciate that storytelling is a skill. Skill is just built of different components, right? And so you won't be very good at this at first. That's okay. Right? It's all about reps. And usually it is something you will do in the second or third drafts. Whenever I start my story, even when I try not to start boring, I start boring. Right? There's always like an edit I can make, or I've said this to a few of you guys, you can just delete the first paragraph. Usually the action is somewhere else. I wrote a story last week in my newsletter that was about a guy I met in Paraguay. And so this was the first line of this one. When I was in Paraguay last September, I had dinner with a guy called Harry. You see this sort of style opener all the time, okay? And it's all right. You're like, okay, maybe I'll give you a bit of my time. And in the second edit, this is what I said. When I was in Paraguay last September, a man named Harry changed my life. You see the difference? How did a man called Harry change Kieran's life? And you're in. Curiosity gap. At this point, you get to set the scene. Okay? So what do I mean by setting the scene? The power of storytelling is that you are not asking someone to believe you anymore. You're just teleporting them to the story, and they can do that work themselves. And to do that, we need to give people details, right? Because if you're vague, if you're wishy-washy, people they're like, I don't know where we are. And so again, like I critique a lot of writing, and usually one of my comments at the start is like, this is a fantastic story, but like, I don't know who you're talking to. You've forgotten to say, like, it's like, I'm on a call. It's like, what call? When? Where? Right? And so we set the scene with details, and I have like a little trick for this that is really, really helpful when you're editing a story. Someone is doing, thinking, feeling something somewhere, sometime. All right, it might sound a little bit overwhelming, but it's actually really simple. Someone is doing, thinking, or feeling something somewhere, sometime. You don't need to tick them all off, but you can be surprised at how you can. Let me show you. I'm staring at a mug. The smiling mug is a cup, by the way, so I don't know if that's universally true. The smiling face decoration taunting me as I try to decide between tea or coffee. I hear two nurses speaking as they walk along the corridor outside. It sounds trivial, but the drink is for my gran. She was rushed into hospital last week when she collapsed at home. The doctor said it was an obstruction in her heart, and tomorrow she goes in for life-threatening surgery. Okay, so how does this look? Someone, somewhere, sometime. I'm doing something. I'm staring at the mug. Okay, which I think I said the word kitchen too. We were somewhere. I'm thinking. I'm trying to decide between a cup of coffee and a cup of tea. I'm feeling. The sob escaped my throat. My gran is going in for surgery. Somewhere, kitchen, yellow smiley face on the mug, hospital. And note how I don't actually tell you hospital. I say there's two nurses walking in the corridor. That's description. And again, this is a skill. So don't worry so much about it, but like that's how we do this. And then sometime, it's the day before a surgery. And that was just, 2-3 sentences. And you're in. Now there's 3 rules here for detail. And by the way, this is basically it. If you can write a good hook and give good detail, you're about 90% of the way with a good story, right? And so this is why I'm spending a bit of time here. The first is to establish the stakes early, okay? Obviously, this is not about the gran last night's date. It's not the same story, but I just want to give you an example here. So your gran going in for life-threatening surgery is pretty high stakes. But quite often in your stories, you're going to tell low-stakes stories, right? Particularly for current storytelling. And so what happens there is that we want to appeal to the reader's self-interest instead. So for example, let's say you went on a date last night and you teach graphic design, right? you just want to make an early promise in the story. The same way for our hooks, we've already discussed this. This could be a great email subject line. Last night's date taught me an important lesson about graphic design. Kieran, I'll see you later. And I saw your question, so I will answer them at the end. Okay, and then so what this does, establishing the stakes early, is that I'm in. I'm here to learn about the graphic design, and I'll listen to your story too, if you get to it. The magic is in the specific. Okay, so I've said this before, but just describing with detail is super, super important. And by the way, guys, this is all written down for you, so you can go through it again too. So don't worry so much. So I could say something like, I wanted to cry, but I held it in. And that doesn't really tell you much about me. It doesn't really keep you in the story. But if I said, I rested my hands on the kitchen counter, my chest heaved as I took a deep breath, a nurse walked into the room, I looked at her, wiped my cheeks and gave a grimace smile, pull it together, I told myself. You'd probably see me as a guy that's quite stoic, but maybe actually a bit of a soft core at the center. I've just done this by specific details. And then don't overdo it. All right. And if you guys have heard this thing called Chekhov's gun, it's Anton Chekhov, master storyteller, said that if there is a gun in scene 1, it must go off by scene 3 or along those lines. Okay. And the mistake that people make is that you spend so long giving details about irrelevant parts of the story. And so one of the biggest tips I find myself saying over and over and over to my clients, I think a few of them are on the calls here, I'm like, stay in the story. All right, no side quests. When I write my stories normally, there's all these little side quests where I'm making remarks and I'll be like, oh, that's a bit like that thing that happened there. Cut that shit out, okay? If the gun isn't going to go off, it doesn't stay in. And so that is the start of a story, okay? We've hooked them. We've set the scene with some detail. Our next job is to keep the reader engaged, because the whole point in content, this is from Joe Sugarman, is to get them to the end, right? Because it's the end where the invitation is, right? And so to do this, there is only one mechanism that you need to know, and that's to create a roller coaster using cause and effect. What is cause and effect? Well, story and life is just a series of cause and effect. Something happened, and then this thing happened. And that's it. We're just bouncing through life with these two things, okay? The mistake that people make when telling stories, particularly early storytellers, well, there's two. Number one is they tell the story in a linear fashion. This thing happened, and then this thing happened, and then this thing happened, and then this thing happened. It's boring. Or they tell it with absolutely no sequence, where they're like, hey, this thing happened, and then this thing happened. Oh, by the way, did I mention that other thing that happened? And oh, also this thing. And that's confusing. Boring and confusing is like a death cocktail for content, all right? And so the way that we link a story together to keep someone engaged in a story but heading in the right direction is a concept called the but and therefore rule. Some of you guys would have heard this. It's from the creators of South Park. And they're fantastic, some of the world's best storytellers, in my opinion. They explain, if you have an and then in your story, you're screwed. Okay, maybe there's like the occasional one, that's fine. But if we have but and therefore, it keeps the story, gives this story this flow that keeps people on the edge of their seat. Okay, the way I like to look at it is, I don't know if you guys ever played that game where you're like the helicopter and you just hit the space bar and the helicopter's going up and down and dodging shit and you're just kind of going like this. That's the shape of a story. Okay, it's not a line, but it goes but it's heading in this one direction, and we can do this. I'm going to show you two versions of the grand story here. So, Gran collapsed in hospital. She asked me to make her a hot drink. That's where we are. For the linear. And it was hard for me to decide. And then I got angry, and then I made 2 cups, and then I went back to her room. Right? It's okay. But and therefore. But it was potentially the final hot drink she would have. Therefore, I couldn't decide and ended up angry and crying. But I realized I was missing the most important time, which is her company. Therefore, I made both cups and went back to her room. It's the same story. And you feel the flow. Okay, so we just discussed what beats are. These are the particular scenes of each part, right? If you want to plan a story, you can write out these little steps and then just button there for it. And it will change the framing of it, but you're not changing the story. You're not making up anything. And by the way, like if, so I write emails that are regularly 1,000 to 2,000 words long. Even if it's not storytelling, I'm just butting in there foring the whole way through. All right, so it's a really, really cool skill. I think it's one of the coolest writing frameworks you can have, and you'll get in the flow of it. If we get some time, I'll show you my getting robbed one. That was just button there for the whole way through. All right. Next rule. One of the biggest concerns my clients have is sounding too self-centered in storytelling, and rightly so. There is nothing more repulsive than a story that is just me, 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 me. I actually, I was at a restaurant last night, my first Ukrainian food. Quite funny, in the urinals, it has a picture of Putin's face with his mouth open. And anyway, there was this girl sitting next to me with another girl. And I swear to God, I had to listen to 40 minutes of her stories. And I was like, wow, I feel so sorry for the other person. Because it was just, I did this, I was on a date with this guy, I just like name dropping it. It's just repulsive, right? And so the way that we avoid this, because we want to use personal storytelling as one of the most impressive tools, is to bounce from me to you. Let me show you what I mean. You actually just heard me do it right there. I stare at the open cupboard, the brands of tea and coffee staring back at me. That's personification. It's a little like play. Okay, so we're still in description. My mind plays scenes of my favorite times in my gran, but also runs through the moments when I did not make an effort, where I was too busy to call, where I sat on my phone when she was talking. Right? So these, the whole point of the story is you can see it. How many times have we all done this? Well, I have. That's the hard part about potentially losing someone. You only realize how important time is, not is was, writer, is when you are about to run out of it. Really powerful. And so what I've done here, okay, is that when you want to make a point, or when you want to say something aspirational or positive, obviously this part's not so aspirational, but it's an important point, swap it to you. And what this does is it creates a highlightable sentence. All right, you're reading along, you know, you're on your Kindle and you're like, oh, that's a nice one, highlight. There's a really cool thing from Morgan Housel. He was like, just try to write as many highlightable sentences as possible in a story. What you don't want to do, okay, is use you when we're talking about negatives, right? So for example, because you don't want to make your reader feel bad. It's one of the main copywriting mistakes. For example, if I want to talk about how you know, it's such a stupid mistake when you try to have 3 spoonfuls of ice cream and end up eating the full tub, I'm not going to be like, you fat piece of shit. I'm going to be like, I'm a fat piece of shit. All right? Because you can read that and be like, hey, me too, but I'm glad Kieran's the one taking the brunt here. And then we talk to you and I'm like, but you know, you're not a bad person. You just really like sugar. Okay? So me to you. Cool way to keep it going. Cause and effect, me to you. You can take that thing for 30 words. You can take it for 3,000 words. But we need to give the lesson. Okay? We need to give the lesson. I saw one of Kieran's questions there was, you know, how do we get good at the lessons? Well, I kind of touched on that at the start. You don't just become some sort of like a wizard at lessons one day. You need to train your mind to look. Okay, because there are lessons everywhere if you choose to look for them. And this is why I haven't been bored in 6 years, because you just start making this link between something happening and something that you can potentially teach your audience. Right? And so you just want to keep an eye out for things. And sometimes there's loads of lessons, sometimes there's not really any. I just take notes, and sometimes I'll read one of my lessons and be like, dude, that's trying way too hard. Cheers, Dave, mate. So yeah, let's look at the lesson for the grand one, and I'll just give you a point or something, and ironically a lesson. I was hanging out with this storyteller once, and he said this really cool quote to me. He was said that no story should be made without a point, and no point should be made without a story. All right, so storytelling to teach. One of the main mistakes, or one of the things that I think can lead to a really good improvement of stories that I don't see spoken about enough, is stay in the story to teach. Okay, so when I'm working with clients, you know, you have your little hook and then you go immediately into teaching mode, and you never come back to the story. You never finish the story. You just sort of went like, here's a hook, and now I'm going to lecture you anyway. But this causes dissonance for your reader, right? Because you created this world for them, even if it's just for 30 seconds, and then you've taken them back out. It's like, just stay in the story to teach for as long as you can. Okay, so let me show you an example. Let me see if I've got any more tea left. Obviously, by the way, for this story, I would just make a cup of tea for me, not coffee. But so, like, I realized how stupid I was being when the kettle clicked. I grabbed another cup and poured a coffee and a tea. My gran smiled as I came back into the room and sat by her bed. Or smiled. You made one for you too? I laughed, put the coffees on the table and held her hand. The next few hours were some of the most magical special we had. Ironically, the drinks went cold, forgotten. The next day, she went in for surgery. Thankfully, she made it, but I still think about this drink situation 2 years later. It made me realize how much time I've wasted worrying about future scenarios. And that worry often causes the thing you fear, like missing time with your loved ones. The present moment is all that counts, so don't stay stuck in your head. Decide fast and spend as much time as you can in reality. Some things you never get back. And you see how smoothly that just kind of went from the end of the story to the lesson, as opposed to me like halfway through talking about the importance of deciding fast, and then being like, so I decided fast, and then I went to see my gran again. Just stay in the story. Okay. And then we have the final part of the story, which we only really need when we're storytelling for our business. That's to pivot to the pitch. So I'm going to say something that a lot of email marketers will grab their pitchforks and chase me, but you do not need to sell your product in every story, okay? But you should always have an invitation. Because if somebody has got to the end of the story, wow, like they're hooked. They're like, well, that did something for me. Thank you. And then, as you know, the way we create a magnetic pull to the center of your world is by making an invitation. Now, I would never, ever use my gran's health to sell a course. Okay. I've seen much worse online, and you should follow your intuition here, right? If it's a super emotional story, like, please don't ruin it by being like, and hey, buy high impact writing. But let me just show you how I do it if I didn't have a soul like a lot of marketers. And if you want to make faster decisions, you'd love my course, Courage and Conviction. You'll see how to never get stuck on the small or big choices again, so you can operate better, be it as a leader or a family member. Over 400 people have taken the product, and you can see why here. You've seen this in the magnetic post format. That's the invitation. I'm just using the seductive promise framework. I've called out what they want. I've given a time frame, or I haven't given a time frame here, but we're given proof. Okay. Me personally, like, if I ever wrote something like that, my skin would crawl, and I'd be like, man, you need to take a step back. This is what I would write at the end of this. I'd love to hear from you. The best lessons come when we're close to death. And I think it's important we share these profound realizations. Reach out. And, the cool thing is, people that do reach out to this stuff, like, you get to have real meaningful conversations as a result of your story. And quite often, those people might end up working with me. Well, not quite often, but there's a potential for it. Okay. So let's wrap this up. A story a day keeps the boredom away. I mentioned before, like, guys, I was not a storyteller 5 years ago. It is a skill that you learn. And one thing I did, I made a commitment to myself when I began to get more and more into it, just to tell a story a day. Which might sound overwhelming, okay? But I'm not talking about like having a Homer's Odyssey every time someone asks you how you are. Okay, a story can be 10 minutes or 10 seconds. In fact, one of the best stories I've ever heard is 6 words long. For sale, baby shoes never worn. Okay, what a roller coaster that is. Short stories. Okay, and what you'll find is it's like opening your third eye. In this way, the more stories you tell, the more you find. And so, you don't go to the gym and deadlift 500 pounds on day one, especially with a back like mine. You start small, you practice, you pick little parts of the technique, and you get better. And when I say get better, so we can use our social media content, right? We can use our newsletters if you guys are running newsletters too. Very effective, in particular in email storytelling, because most emails are really boring. So stories will set you apart. But also, you can, again, we mentioned start practice through conversation, right, with everyone. For example, if someone asks me how I am now, I will almost always tell them something about what I've been up to. Right? Not that, yeah, I'm good. Right? I'm like, yeah, I'm good. Yesterday I got lost in the woods. And when you're at the start of the call, you heard me do it. And the reason I'm doing that is because it creates so much serendipity. People like to hear stories. It just gives you, and it gives someone else the talking point too. Like, hey, I'm good. It's like, great, nice talking to you. But when you say something like, yeah, I'm cool. I've just been working on this thing today. Say, oh wow, good. Tell me more. Okay, so you actually open up people when you have this habit. The other side of it is when you're on the phone with clients and they ask you a question, right? Try not dive into teaching. Tell the story. And you'll find that the stories that start coming out, they become the stories that you tell in your content. So, in the live talk I was giving before, I was sitting next to people and for example, I mentioned about shame in the live talk, and a guy came up to me and was like, hey, you mentioned this word shame. I would kind of like to learn more because I have shame. And what I could have done would be like, yo, here's the book, here's the course, bugger off. But actually what I told him was a story about how I discovered that I had shame and the work I'd been doing to do it. We spoke for like 5 minutes and the guy was like, holy shit. All right. And so if you try to answer every question with a story as well, you're going to find a lot of material. And I think that's going to be about it. All right. So content, conversations. And I hope you found that useful.